Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. My name is Adam, I'm an ancient Greek reenactor and history enthusiast, and today I'm joined by Till Casper, who I met at the recent Plataea 2500th anniversary. Till has contributed to the Linothorax.de research project, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, who those of you from the Invicta channel will know as the Sweat Licker. And we are here today to talk about ancient Greek armours and sort of specifically clear up some misconceptions and shine a light into some areas which perhaps lots of people aren't clear on.
So yeah, what do we want to talk about today? It's Greek armours, Greek armour misconceptions to a certain extent, and I think the best way to start is to start with a bit of interesting and fresh terminology and definitions, right?
I think so. So I think sort of the first armour that we can really talk about is the bell cuirass, which was very prominently depicted in the Archaic era. Now, our good friend Robin, who was also on the Invicta video, has sent us some pictures of him and his kit, and this features a bell cuirass. So thank you very much, Robin. I'll leave a link to his site down below, as well as the research project that Till's a part of. So please go ahead and check those out. But yeah, so here we have some pictures of Robin in his bell cuirass. And this was a bronze thorax style armour, which was really characterised by its bell flaring out waist. Now this was a very prominent and seemingly effective armour for the Greeks, because it was used for a very long time. And it was quite close fitting, and there are some misconceptions about the way that you can't move in bronze armour, but Till, maybe perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. On another image that we can show you now, it basically shows you how body armors throughout almost the millennia have dealt with the same problem. When does an armor impede your movement? It will impede your movement if it is tight-fitting and precluding over your natural waist, which a well-fitting, a well-made bell cuirass won't do. And the name-giving characteristic of the bell cuirass, the bell shape, is exactly that. Up to the natural waist, it's super tight-fitting. That's the point slightly below your rib cage, where the natural movement of your body actually happens. To the sides,
pretty close to the belly button.
Yeah, slightly above the belly button with most people, actually. That's why old-timey pants sit at the natural waist, and for us it's grandpa pants. But if we ever wore them, they're comfortable like nothing good. So yes, that's the whole system of the bell cuirass. Be very tight up to the point where the natural waist sits, and after that it flares out. You have the characteristic bell form. Why the bell form? Because below the natural waist, below the abdomen, or below the natural waist, you will have the abdomen. And as you see on the image that we are showing on the screen right now, that's where some of the most vulnerable parts of the body actually are. You have no protection by a rib cage. Depending on the person, you have some fat, you have some muscle, but below that you have a part of the body that will take a lot of blood if hurt. And that's why it's important to make armors longer than that, but not tight at that point, if that makes sense.
So yeah, coming out of the bell cuirass, there's sort of a transitional phase where this sort of becomes into the very famously known muscle cuirass. So there's an example here from Robin with a maybe closer fitting bell cuirass style. It's a little bit more of a transition period cuirass. You can see that the bell flared out waist is being slightly eliminated, and this is my personal favourite style of cuirass, is the one that's on the screen now, which is a bronze figure from Messenia, where it's sort of a bell cuirass that's transitioning into a muscle cuirass. So the top still has the swirly bell cuirass, and the bottom comes into some light musculature. And then coming out of that, we see the very famous bronze muscle cuirass, which the image here is my kit at the Plataea event. And this cuirass is really more of a classical and even Hellenistic style cuirass. We have very few examples of it being used in classical Greece, close to the 5th century. We do have a few examples, but they're usually slightly less anatomically correct. This style of cuirass, there's a quite prominent depiction dated to around 450 to 425 BC, which is around the Peloponnesian War. So this style of armour is not very Persian War era, but would fit for a Peloponnesian War kit.
And I can absolutely understand why it's so often depicted in reenacting, in artwork, depicting the era, like modern artwork, because it just looks badass. It just looks cool. Yeah, why are we showing you those types of armor? We're showing you in order to make you understand a term for the next kind of armor we want to show you, which is Type 4. So we have Type 1, which is the classical belt cuirass. We have Type 2, which is a alternated version of the belt cuirass. We have Type 3, which is the muscle cuirass. And then we have Type 4, which we will show to you in a minute. And that's a typology that was put forward by a Finnish, if I remember correctly, archaeologist by the name of Jarva. For the first 3 armors, the typology name didn't really catch up. However, for the 4th armor, for the tube and yoke, for the Linothorax, for the Type 4, that's actually a term that's used quite often.
Right, and the Linothorax, or Linothorax, depending on your pronunciation, can be a little bit of a misleading term, because we actually don't know what these armours are made of. They are really categorized or characterized by 3 features that they have, which is the yoke, which are the shoulders, the tube, which goes around the torso, and the terragaes, which are the flaps around the waist. The Linothorax sort of keys you in on it possibly being made of linen, hence Linothorax. But again, we actually don't know whether it was made of linen, leather, or some later things that we cover in this video could maybe change that perspective as well.
I will try. It's a hard fight, because especially with recent YouTube videos in the last 10 years, with some publications that came out in the last 10 years, the term Linothorax has become connected with that type of armor, which is problematic, because it will always be an interpretation. We have a depiction of a tube and yoke armor, we call it a Linothorax, and we push our interpretation on the image through that. So the purpose of this video, the next couple of minutes of this video, will be to look into which materials those tube and yoke armors could have been made out of. So we already kind of defined the term tube and yoke. We have an armor that has the yoke, the tube, the thorax part, and there are actually surviving examples of that kind of armor. And probably one of the most famous of those would be the Goliamata Mogila armor.
Now this armor is a really interesting armor because it largely is intact. Now this shows a leather core with, I believe, iron scales covering it, and you can see it very closely fits to the waist and flares out.
Yes, we have the same base shape, incidentally, that we see on the belt cuirass. You have it be tapered down, very tight at the natural waist, and the basically the job of the belt part is now taken over by the terragaes. In this specific example, you can see that the terragaes on the sides are longer than on front, and together with the cutouts on the side and the fact that it was found with a gorget, suggests to us that this was actually cavalry armor.
And it's very interesting, as lots of cavalry armor is either depicted as being a shortened version of the sort of traditional muscle cuirass, or a tube and yoke style armor.
So yes, there we have one of the surviving examples. We note down, first surviving example, base, thick, 3 to 4 millimeter leather, which for our American friends, it's roughly half a bullet. And the actual armor part is very thin iron scales.
Alright, and moving down, we have another 4th century example, which was the alleged armour of Philip the Great of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, and this shows the, again, very characterised tube and yoke style armour, with the yokes over the top and the tube, and the pteryges in this example seem to have rotted away, but this armour differs from the traditional perception of this style of armour, as its core is made of iron.
We have this beautiful armor. Absolutely, it's an armor made of metal plates. It's hinged together. It was actually in its original form wrapped in fabric. So from the outside, it would have been very hard to say that it is a metal armor. People often say that it's a parade armor. What do you think? What do you think of that?
I think it's really impossible to tell whether it was a parade armour or not. I think it's very ornately designed, especially with the gold trim. Personally, though, and this is just sort of my opinion, but I don't think that as a parade armour you would make it a core of metal, because it seems that that adds a massive amount of protective elements to it, and just being as a decorative parade armour, I don't see why it would be necessary to have so much protection.
I'm absolutely with you. I would say that's a fully functional armor. On the first view, it looks very uncomfortable. It looks like basically a tin can. But if you look closely, you'll find out that the front plate, and to a certain extent even the side plates, are just slightly trapezoid instead of rectangular. That means that the whole armor actually tapers very well to the body. It's cut rather shortly. You have a big cutout on the upper body. So yes, it is functional, especially for a high status individual, which Philip the Great was, that probably didn't need to march long distances with the armor. It's absolutely usable.
That's right. I think that's one thing that we also have to remember when we look at perhaps perceived heavier armours, is that it wouldn't necessarily have to have been worn for a very long period of time, especially by the upper class, wealthy tiers of society, because they have slaves, they have horses, and really they're only having to wear it at the time that they're actually fighting with it.
Absolutely, and if I remember correctly, the weight is at about 8 kilos, which honestly for body armor isn't all that much. It's also not the only example of a late 4th century iron armor. Another one was found also in the Macedonian context at the Agios Athanasios grave, which many of you might know because of the frescoes that were found in the same grave. And sadly, it's not well publicized, so best I can offer for you at the moment is this image. But what we can see is basically the same base construction. Tube and yoke shape, metal parts. What we see with this armor is that the front plate is doubled, just like some of the muscle cuirasses that were thicker in front than in the rear, but another functional iron armor.
And it's very interesting to me that lots of later styles of this tube and yoke do seem to be metal, and it does sort of beg the question whether some of the depictions that we see in ancient Greek depictions also feature a metallic core. Now, the slight issue with this is that the Greeks used bronze, and one of the best parts about bronze is that it doesn't rust, it oxidizes. And that is why we have such well-preserved ancient Greek items such as helmets and cuirasses. And if lots of tube and yokes were metallic cored, especially with bronze, we'd have a lot more surviving ones that are still around today, which sadly we don't have. So this does indicate perhaps a slightly more organic construction.
It sure does. There are some older books, especially one of the earlier Osprey books on hoplite warfare, where the author actually states that most tube and yoke was probably made of metal. And I see where that idea comes from, because especially Vase depictions like the Achilles painter look almost exactly like the Phillips armor. One explanation why we don't have more archaeological evidence is that they, even at an earlier age, were made from iron plates and they rusted away. However, there is, I think, good evidence for organic tube and yoke armor too, which we will come to in the later parts of the video.
I think it's definitely a theory that we shouldn't toss aside as being a possible type for this armor, but I think at least for an ancient Greek standpoint, it wasn't necessarily the main construction.
Absolutely. I think the same. I can't prove it, and that's probably the most interesting part about research on the tube yoke armor. But again, I'm totally with you. I don't think that all or the majority of tube yoke armors were made in that way, but we know they were around, and maybe someone has an Agios Athanasios metal tube yoke armor currently in the pipeline to be reproduced. Maybe. So another surviving example of a metal tube yoke is the Cyprus armor, which is currently on display in some Scandinavian country, and I forgot which. I think in Sweden. And here again we have a scale tube yoke armor. Problem is, I'm not entirely sure whether the current state is a reconstruction based just on the amount of scales they found, or if it was actually found in a context where it was a fair assessment to say yes, the scales were put in that way. Either way, we know it was around, and we have another archaeological example for a full scale tube yoke armor, this time from, if I remember correctly, the 6th century BC. But those are actually all of the surviving complete sets of tube yoke armor that survive today. Sadly, we don't have any surviving linen or leather or any other material full set of armor. Maybe there are fragments, and maybe we'll come to that later. So what are the best sources to look into tube yoke armor? Actually, we have a myriad of depictions in Vase arts. I mentioned this armor earlier. This is a depiction of the Achilles painter and the basis for my armor reconstruction.
And I mean, the Linothorax or tube and yoke style armor is vastly depicted in ancient Greek vase art. Like, it is basically on every depiction of a hot plate, especially coming into the classical era, shows this style of armor.
Absolutely, and there's a huge amount of variation. We will, if you guys are interested, at a later time make a video on the reconstruction, and if you guys want to build one yourself, we might be able to help. One thing that you see, however, on most depictions is that they are rather form-fitting, they are rather tight, so they fit close to the body. They are rather short because they are so short, they have to end at the natural waist. And that's one of the reasons why I love the Achilles painter, because if you look closely, you will see exactly where the pteryges end and what can be seen below them. So the pteryges don't protect the upper thighs, they don't protect the groin area. They're only there to protect the abdomen area.
I think that's actually a very important part to stress, because I think many people, and it's a very common misconception, that armor makes your mobility basically non-existent. But armorers weren't stupid, and obviously people wouldn't wear armor if it negatively impacted them more so than it helped. And I think many people think of ancient armors and even medieval armors coming down to your hips as opposed to your waist, and that is a massively important factor. Is if you have a piece of armor that comes down to just above your belly button, it really doesn't restrict your movement really at all, especially if you have a flap like the pteryges coming down to cover the rest of your torso that are movable. Then your mobility is great and your protection is great.
Absolutely, and that's actually a system that you will see throughout the ages. You see it with Japanese samurai armor, you will see it with Gothic armors, you will see it with even modern body armors working exactly that way. If you have a modern plate carrier that ends at about the belly button, and if you want to protect your lower abdomen, there's additional soft armor options for most systems. So actually a very, very, very close comparison to tube yoke. So yes, that's what we can see from Vase depictions. What we definitely can say is which material they were made of. Kind of counterstating our earlier statements on pteryges would be this Fresco, which is from the aforementioned Agios Athanasios grade. And here you see Hellenistic, and I mean truly Hellenistic tube yoke armor. Um, but one thing that this source provides for us is color.
Right, it is very interesting, especially with I forget which museum it was, but they recolorized statues, and it's very interesting to see the very vibrant and bright colors that our modern eyes would consider quite weird and unusual to be seen in these armors, but to the ancients it seems that this was the style, and I think it's very important to know that the very washed out white marble that we commonly see was really not a very accurate portrayal of the ancients. And they loved colour, they loved very bright, vibrant colours, and that was also portrayed in their buildings, their clothes, and also their armours.
Absolutely. From the top of my head, I'm aware of a surprising amount of yellow armors. Like on this one, we will see another example later on. There were pink armors. There were probably red armors. I think there's one depictions of blue. So yes, they were brightly colored because that's how you show status. And our ideal, we have also depictions of white armors, even textual evidence of white armors, which will become interesting later on. But we also, again, definitely know that some of them were brightly colored. Another source for Teuton yoke armors would be statues. Um, this one is incidentally not from a Greek context, but from a contemporary Celtic depiction. And you will see that all of the elements that we saw on the other armors, except maybe for the length, is also present here with the Glauberger Keltenfürst, which is basically the depiction of a Celtic chieftain from the Latin culture.
Hmm.
And why that is important, we will come to that when we talk about some of the fragments that were found, because Teuton yoke was probably not only worn by the ancient Greeks, and might not even have come from them. We have our statues, we have our steles, and this one is a great example because we again see how the Linothorax fits, how short it is cut, how now I said it myself, how the pteryges work, and we have a great example for color.
This is, I believe, from the exhibit that I mentioned earlier about the recolorization of ancient sculptures, and again you can see
Yep.
even the greaves being painted. The Teuton yoke has again another yellow color, and yellow, blue, red, and green, which are colors that certainly I believe most modern people would not consider armor being painted.
Of course, we have to put in some source criticism here. We don't know if the stuff was actually that color, whether that was some artistic license. However, people coming around with the argument of artistic license, well, that's an argument that you can put on everything that we have in those sources. So it's a bit problematic. So I would take it for some face value, honestly. And yeah, the last kind of sources that we can look at in order to gain information on the Teuton yoke armor are mosaics. Most of them are from the Roman era, so they depict things that are 100, 200 years in the past. I think with the famous Alexander mosaic from Pompeii, however, it's based on an older original that's not surviving.
Mm.
And some of the details depicted, like a sword, like the Boeotian helmet in the rear, are super detailed and realistic. So I think we can take it for some face value. And again, we see beautiful pteryges, this time even pteryges protruding from the epimedes,
Hmm.
protecting the arms. And this, and that might be a good segue to further parts. It's actually a good example for marrying the terminology and the imagery. Because we do, in fact, have the term linothorax, we do have the term spolas, uh, explaining historical armors, right?
Hmm.
So we have Xenophon talking about linothoraces, we have Homer talking about linothoraces being thoraces leonoi, but still armors made of linen. Uh, However, firstly, they often talk about foreigners wearing those. There's one story, I think, by Herodotus of a Greek, not Greek, Egyptian pharaoh um, presenting a linen corselet as a present to the Greeks. But it's hard to tell which of the depictions that we have are which kind of armor. And here with Alexander, we know that he wore linen armor, that he was even wounded while wearing linen armor, and we have a depiction of him showing him wear this kind of armor, which suggests to me it could be linen. Also, apart from the old metal armors, we actually have some evidence for organic tube and yoke armors in the archaeological context.
That's right. We have lots of actually really cool sort of bronze and gold pieces that also survive from these styles of armor.
Absolutely. One of them is from Vergina. So, in the same grave, probably of Alexander's dad. Additionally to in addition to the iron armor, there's also remnants of armor from natural materials, be it linen, be it leather. We can tell in form of this beautiful, in how far as a gorgo can be beautiful, gorgon head, which was probably attached at the chest, and the closing rings used for closing the sides and the top of the armor together, made in beautifully embossed gold. Also, we have fragments of armor, I think also from Bulgaria, which is the Golyama grave. Sadly, I can only provide you with the sketch, but there were scales, there were closing mechanisms, and additional nice plates just for decoration on it. We also have fragments from a Celtic context, with those fittings in a position where the armor fittings would need to be for a tube and yoke armor, and those even have remnants of a linen thread around them.
So yeah, it seems that we have certainly a vast amount of evidence that supports the very much organic armors, and perhaps it was more of a Hellenistic transition that popularized the metallic armors, or really it's just an area that we're left in the dark.
Absolutely. I mean, the metallic tube and yoke armors, of course, but yeah, you were saying that, of course. But yes, we know there were organic tube and yoke armors. The big question is, what were they made of? So we know there were organic armors. Again, we know of leather armors because we have surviving samples, even though they are full of scales. There are ways to turn leather into a good base material for armor, but we have no sources of the Greeks using them. There are, however, again, also good sources, literary sources for linen armors. So we have Xenophon, we have Homer, we have Herodotus, and we have some fragments. The big question, however, is how can we turn the fabric, linen or flax, the fiber, into functional armor?
So there are a few theories regarding this. One of them is the theory of glued linen, which was really championed by Peter Connolly. Now this was not really based on ancient sources, but the base idea is that several layers were connected with holes in weave and are closed by a hide or starch glue. If it's done correctly, it does actually produce quite a strong armour. However, there is no real evidence supporting this as being a thing that the ancients did, and could be considered more of a reenactorism than an actual source.
Absolutely. So, long story short, it was made popular by Peter Connolly in the 1970s, I believe, and he based it on a medieval source, probably being a translation mistake. I would, however, not entirely disregard this approach. Because we do know that the Greeks did glue linen on things. We know they did it with shields, where you have several layers of glued linen. And if you ever worked with that, putting 1 or 2 layers of glued linen on anything will actually make it much, much sturdier. So it is possible that they did it, but we don't have the best sources for it. Here we have an example for Epomedes. It's a prototype we did with our university project, but done right, they are very springy, they are very sturdy. However, again, we don't have the best sources for that.
And that leads us sort of to another theory, which is quilted linen. And this was sort of used throughout history as a good way of connecting and stiffening linen armours. And again, there's sort of no direct evidence to the classical, archaic, or Hellenistic era, but it is quite a strong leading theory.
So what you do is, instead of gluing the fabric together, you just, put ideally very tight stitches all around it. If you quilt it close enough, you actually have the springiness that you see on many other depictions. And there's at least one slight piece of evidence, not from the classical, archaic, or Hellenistic, but the Mycenaean era. But again, a small piece of fabric armor that's most probably quilted. Sadly, it has been lost in the last couple of years, and there's not much research. But again, we know that there was some armor of a similar making in the greater Greek world, even though a bit earlier than in the time that we are looking at. There's, however, also a third version of turning linen into armor.
And this is sort of twine woven linen. So we do have some surviving 4th century fragments from Etruscan and 1st century fragments from Roman or Jewish contexts.
Absolutely, because I'm one of the crazy people that actually tried that out. So in the middle, you actually see an image of the actual fragments that were found in Masada. So they're, again, not technically from a Roman context, but especially with the Herodian soldiers, there are interpretations that they were still pretty much equipped like Hellenistic soldiers. And the lady who wrote the paper on those archaeological finds interpreted them as elements of pteryges. And actually, that's a great way of making pteryges, and I will come to why. First off, what is the difference between twine weaving and weaving? Basically, when you weave, you have your warps, which are the straight strings that hang down, and then you have your weft that's basically wrapped around, over and under in alternating patterns depending on the weave. When twine weaving, you don't have one, but basically two warps. And that's where the name comes from. Just like in twining a string, or twining string into twine, you take those two warps and you twist them against each other around one or two weft. This creates an extremely dense fabric and an extremely stable fabric, because the twine that you then again intertwine has pressure in it. So it holds together very tightly, very, very swiftly. On the right, you see an image that was made by authentically made, pulled, and twined strings. And it's very close, almost uncannily close to the archaeological evidence. And even though it's only 3 or 4 millimeters thick, one has a hard time to get through it with a knife. Another option that you have when twine weaving is to put two wefts behind each other. And you basically get a 3D weave, which gets thicker and denser. And you can have one piece that starts as one piece, and then, which you will see on the next picture, turns into 2 layers of pteryges from 1 layer of fabric. And what's interesting about this way of making armor from linen is the connection we can make to the Alexander mosaic.
That's right. So we can see that under the pteryges, or appears to be under the pteryges, are these sort of strands that look like the bottoms of the quilted example that we just saw. So this could indicate that these pteryges were actually of that design.
Absolutely, and many reenactors go to a lot of work in order to add those fringes at the ends of their pteryges, especially when it comes to Hellenistic or Roman reenactors. If you actually do the twine weaving thing, that comes out natural. You just fix it with a ribbon in the end, so it can't open up again. So yeah, those are the 3 main options how to turn linen into body armor. And if you ask me, the most likely solution for ancient Greek armors when it comes to linen body armor, especially because the historical evidence also describes the armor that was given by the Egyptian pharaoh to the Greeks with huge details on the individual strands. So he's talking about how densely it is turned, which only really makes sense if we talk about twine woven material.
Now this poses a question for me anyway, is that the twine woven armour has a very defined sort of texture to it. It has the cross-weaved marks. So, do you think that this would have perhaps been harder to paint, or would they have dyed the linen first, or how do you think that they would have gone about decorating this style?
A good thing about linen is that it actually gets very nice and bright just through the sun. With the smaller linen fragment, with the very thin strands, you can actually paint it using basically a gesso. Andrew Yamato made some great experiments with basically the ground material that you use for making porcelain, which was mixed in, which also gives it better protective capabilities. Another option, of course, is to wrap it into woven linen.
I think that just about sums up this video. Thank you so much, Chill, for all of your work and putting this together, and it's been really interesting. I think sort of how we can summarize this is, at the end of the day, we don't know how they were made. I think it's safe to say there was no uniform way that these were made. You would have a vast variety of different tube and yoke styled armours all created in their own way. And I hope that this cleared up to you guys who've watched the whole video, sort of maybe a few spots that you personally aren't sure about with this style of armour, and obviously we still have a lot more that we can learn and hopefully will discover in the future.
Let Adam know, and we might be able to make another video for you guys, giving you some pointers in how to make your own.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely talking to you again, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.